Hi there. This video presentation is to prepare you for the next video, which is about the world within and the world without. And I wanted to explore a little bit about mystical language and reality. You see, post 18th century in the West, the basic rule of thumb is that if I hear the sound of horse hooves on the ground, I don't automatically think of unicorns. And that pretty much sums up the Enlightenment. Okay. I believe what I see with my senses, and scientific instruments make my senses sharper, more sensitive, more penetrating. So we can go further into matter, and then I can observe with my senses what's going on at the molecular level and even the subatomic level. All well and good. So I don't necessarily, have to believe in unicorns when I hear the sound of hooves. It could very well just be a natural phenomenon occurring. And even if I haven't observed that natural phenomenon, I have no reason to suspect that I can't, on some level, observe it. And if I haven't observed it yet, then I will be able to observe it sometime in the future. So what we don't understand about nature now, we will understand in the future, and everything will have a scientific sensory explanation, which is something that we can appreciate with our senses primarily, and that scientific theories, will be backed up with scientific data, and that data will be detectable via the material senses and understandable via the workings, the neurolytic processes of the brain. So that's post 18th century. That's post Enlightenment. Before that, people had an idea that if you could imagine something, it was possibly real or probably real. And they had an idea also that that if you wore a red shirt, you could ward off evil spirits, because it was observed that if you wore a red shirt, you had better luck on certain days than you did on others. And you had various personal belief systems like that, beliefs coming up, which became sort of tradition. Became, you keep the rabbit's paw, like, you know what I mean? But I think that even in the days when people thought that, mental illness and not schizophrenia, because they wouldn't have called it that, but mental illness, mental dysfunction would be recognized. And it would be recognized that people were hallucinating, and not in a good way, as it were, in a way that really was a result of their mental health problems. But there was also recognition that it was possible for a mystic or a shaman, with the help of hallucinogenic drugs and other practices that stimulated the psychic areas of the brain, to basically go into another dimension or other dimensions, have experiences there, and then record those experiences in language that it was possible to refer to, possible to for everyone to relate to, like, wings of an angel, or burning bushes and things like that. So we know what burning is, and we know what a bush is. Never seen a bush spontaneously catch fire before, but but the shaman says that's what he or she saw on another dimension, and sometimes they saw it, as it were, in real life as well, and that's recorded, and so people have an idea. That's a burning bush. And it was a miracle from God, because it's just started to burn on its own, and all well and good on that. So But you'd have to use language that people could understand. But maybe you could also use sigils that people didn't understand, but that you had to understand eventually. So you go into your other dimension, you come back, if you're a shaman. And of course, shamans and mystics were people that weren't actually insane. They were unusual people. They were different people, for sure. They were different from when they were very young. But they weren't considered to be disturbed. They were considered to be to have special powers or specialness about them, which enabled them to go into another dimension and come back and report on what they saw in a perfectly rational way, as if anybody had gone over the hill and come back from over the hill and reported what they'd seen there. And you didn't go over the hill, but because you trusted what the person said, you were prepared to believe what they did see, what they did, what prepared to believe them. And you believed that their account was true because the person was held in high esteem, and you basically trusted what they said because they were trustworthy people. Whereas a mentally ill person perhaps wasn't trustworthy. I mean, they could say one thing on Monday and another thing on Tuesday, and that was pretty much a sign that they weren't thinking straight. But on the other hand, there were also people that had superstitions based on what they call in CBT false beliefs, and beliefs about about influencing the world by wearing the right coloured shirt or handkerchief or something like that, or keeping the rabbit's foot, or throwing salt over your left shoulder or whatever. So you had sort of superstitions becoming law and tradition, village tradition, and then you had people who were recognised to have mental problems, and then you had the shaman, the mystic, the priest, who were in another category again. Now, of course, nowadays, obviously, the empiricist, humanist, atheist is going to obviously say all this is gobbledygook. You should only believe your five senses, and science will make everything detectable in the end and everything explainable in the end. But I think nowadays that there's also recognition that this isn't quite adequate enough either, and that perfectly sane, respectable, trustworthy people are people of good character and good standing, and people who are not who don't have something completely, they're not pedophiles or something like that. People do have extraordinary experiences and miracles and experience miracles in the here and now. But apart from the miracles, people do have visions and things like that. And they weren't going around looking for visions. They weren't even taking drugs to get visions. They were just walking along the road one day and they had a vision or something, and they had various experiences which they had to record and report in language that, again, that human beings can relate to. So I kind of had this idea in the night, about don't worry about the language that people use. I mean, people talk about God having a white beard, an old man in the sky with a white beard. Well, you could have an experience, right, of something like that. And you come back and you say, I know that God has got a white beard, he's an old man in the sky, right? But these words that you're using, they're sort of signposts to the truth. It's a bit like, and they're not that important. I mean, it's a bit like, being on the freeway to Chicago and seeing the junction indicators or the junction signposts to Chicago. You're not going to remember the freeway. You're not going to remember those signposts saying this way to Chicago. When you get to Chicago, you're just going to experience Chicago, right? And when you bring somebody up from Chicago, you're going to describe Chicago to the person who's never been there either. And because they trust you and trust what you're saying, they think you're pretty much saying the truth about what you've experienced in Chicago. And you're not going to tell them about the signposts and about the freeway. They're not interested in that. They're interested in the experience of where you actually went, not how you got there, and not the signposts that directed you there. So the language, the mystical language that people use, it's sort of like a signpost. It just sort of says, well, this way to heaven, as it were, or this way to this experience of God. The language is not important. So the language hasn't a literal meaning. So there really isn't an old man with a white beard in the sky. It's just that's how people perceived the divine to be. Now, of course, some fundamentalists say, "Don't you don't you put all your postmodernist rubbish on us? We believe that Jesus is a man, and that we will see Jesus in the flesh, and we'll have fleshly, we will have, there will be a new Jerusalem made, and it will look like the world will look the same world, but it will be a perfect world." And there really is an old man with a beard in the sky. Literally, there is, and that's certainly what people used to believe, but now we look at language in a bit of a different way. We're not saying that language, there should be something like an old man with a white beard living in the sky because the words point to that. What we're just saying is that there's a set of experiences which are based on a reality that is inconceivable, and indescribable, and people are just making wild descriptions of what they experience because they can't do anything less than that. But it's not to say that you can't actually experience these realities, or that these realities in other dimensions are not actually real, not actually there. So you get to Chicago, and Chicago actually exists. It's not just a signpost. It's not just this way to Chicago, because when you get there, it really does exist, and it could take you by surprise. You could say, "Oh," because you could have a lot of, you could imagine lots of things about Chicago, but when you get there, it's kind of different from what you imagined. And so you might think that there's a figure of Jesus hanging in the sky, but when you actually get there, it's something very different. But nevertheless, something which is as detectable as anything detectable by your five senses on this planet now. I think that nowadays, I don't think that the Enlightenment has disproved the existence of God, just because of the statement, when I hear the sound of hooves, I don't think of unicorns. I don't think that proves or disproves anything, really. And we're not dissing empiricism or science or anything like that. We're not anti-science. We're just saying that complementary to science and complementary to empiricism and the detection of truth via the five senses, it's possible that you can project your consciousness into other dimensions, or have dimensions sort of snatch up your consciousness and bear it away for a little bit, and then for you to come back and say, "Hey, I've had a transcendental experience," and this is how I would describe it. Given that my description of it is probably not even what it was I actually experienced. It's just something that I have to use some language, because otherwise I just sort of go yarby darby darby doo, and that wouldn't mean anything. I just have to babble. That wouldn't mean anything. But even babbling can mean something. I mean, even this sort of completely nondescript doodling of mine can possibly mean something. I mean, it's just lines and circles and graffiti, basically. But I mean, somebody might say, "Oh, I know what that means," and I might not even know what it means, but you might know what it means, and you might think that these noodlings and doodlings have some relationship with some kind of transcendental experience that you have had. I don't know. I don't think they mean anything as far as I'm concerned, but perhaps they mean something to you. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Meaning is there to be found. But of course, I know the empiricist will say, well, this is all garbage. What are you talking about? This is rubbish. Professor Grayling wouldn't have any of this. But I don't think that the Enlightenment really is that enlightening, actually. And I think that long ago people recognised it was possible to have an hallucination which didn't mean anything, which didn't have any transcendental reality. So the person that had mental problems really was somebody who had mental problems. And perhaps people recognised that superstitions were superstitions. But then when you got to the area of the mystic, and of the priest and of the psychic or whatever, and of the shaman, then you might be entering into a different category altogether. And it might be that the shaman basically had an internal telescope or microscope or whatever or particle accelerator in their mind, that gave them access to mysteries of the world which we normally don't have access to. And that's basically, and describing their experiences in language that we do have access to in terms of meaning. So we know what wings are, we know what a bush is, we know what flames are, and whatever. And you put the two together, and you have burning wings on a flying bush. And as I said, you sort of have a picture in your mind, but it's a picture which has no relation, in fact, to what the shaman actually experienced or what the mystic actually experienced, or maybe not really even the miracle that the whole crowd of people perceived. They just, add post hoc rationalization. They just said, "Oh, we saw Saint Anne floating above the pool." Or the spring, and 100 people saw it, but that's just how they looked at it or how they saw it. But in fact, what they saw was something completely utterly other and indescribable. In fact, but they couldn't not describe something, so they had to describe it in terms of a saint that they knew something about from tradition, and then they could say, "Oh, we saw Saint Anne." In this spot in Ireland or wherever, or St. Catherine or whatever, and that would be like a miracle. And a lot of people saw it, and I don't think that science really can disprove any of that. And then, of course, postmodernist, we have to consider what all this means. Because you can have experiences all you like, but if you don't derive any meaning from them, and you don't derive any moral sort of story from what happens to you, then you might as well be a mad person or a mad person that's drunk or high. Do you know what I mean? So it's not only that the shaman brings back stories of what happened to them in heaven, they also bring back some kind of wisdom, some kind of insight into the human condition, or to how we should live better, and how we should live more harmoniously with ourselves. So they'll bring back something useful like that, as well as the experience itself. So don't forget that there's a moral and a meaningful sort of facet to mystical experience, which again, is completely outside. I mean, empiricism can't say yes or no to that. I mean, if it's a story that's going to have a moral that helps people to live better, then you can't really knock that. And if you try to knock that, then I would suggest that you are setting up science to be a religion, and you're being religiously bigoted against other people's belief systems, and you're really actually belittling science itself by belittling people's beliefs. You're actually diminishing science and not defending it. That's my own take on that as a scientist. So be careful how you knock people, and be careful about the motivation for why you're saying something is gobbledygook because it might not be as pure as you would like it to be or as it should be. So that's my little thoughts really on mystical language, and what I think that mystical language is, as it were. But I mean, who can really say what it is that they've heard? Have they heard, the sound of horses, or have they heard the sound of unicorns? I had to get that punchline in at the end, didn't I? Really.